On the morning of November 14, 1983, a janitor at the Hanford Research Institute in rural Washington state unlocked the door to Laboratory 7B and found it empty. Not just empty of people, empty in a way that suggested something had been carefully, methodically erased. Dr. Emil Corvin, a physicist who'd worked alone in that lab for nearly 8 years, was gone. His notebooks were gone. The chalkboards had been wiped clean. Even the coffee cup he was known to leave on his desk every night, unwashed, a personal quirk his colleagues joked about, had vanished. What remained was stranger than what was missing. A single page of equations, pinned to the corkboard with a thumbtack. A reel-to-reel tape recorder, sitting on the floor in the center of the room, unplugged, its tape removed. And scratched into the surface of the wooden desk with something sharp, 3 words in shaky capital letters. They were right. The FBI investigation that followed lasted 6 weeks and concluded with a 2-page report that raised more questions than it answered. Dr. Corvin's colleagues described him as brilliant but withdrawn, a man who'd become increasingly paranoid in his final months. His apartment was found undisturbed. His car remained in the parking lot. No body was ever recovered. The case went cold. For 42 years, Laboratory 7B remained locked, its contents boxed and filed away in a government storage facility in Oregon. Then, in January of 2021, a records request filed by a research journalist resulted in the release of Corvin's personal files, documents that had somehow been overlooked during the original investigation. What they contained has reignited interest in a mystery that many had assumed would never be solved. If this already has you hooked, hit that subscribe button, because what Dr. Emil Corvin discovered in that isolated laboratory may have been too dangerous to share and too terrifying to forget. Emil Corvin was born in 1931 in a small town outside of Prague, Czechoslovakia. His father taught mathematics at a local gymnasium. His mother was a librarian. By all accounts, young Emil was a prodigy, reading by age 3, solving complex mathematical problems by 6, and showing an almost obsessive interest in the nature of time and space. The war years were difficult. The Corvin family survived the Nazi occupation, but Emil's father disappeared in 1944. The circumstances were never fully explained. In interviews conducted decades later, Emil would only say that his father had been taken for asking questions. It's a phrase that would prove eerily prophetic. In 1949, as Czechoslovakia fell under Soviet control, the Corvin family fled to Austria and from there emigrated to the United States. They settled in New York, where Emil's talents quickly attracted attention. He earned his undergraduate degree from Columbia at 19, his PhD from Princeton at 23. His dissertation on temporal anomalies in quantum field theory was considered revolutionary, though many of his professors privately admitted they didn't fully understand it. By 1955, Corvin had been recruited by the U.S. Department of Energy to work on classified research at a facility in New Mexico. The exact nature of this work remains classified even today, but declassified personnel records indicate he was part of a team studying the after effects of nuclear testing on atmospheric conditions. Colleagues from this period describe him as intense, focused, and haunted by something he never discussed openly. Then, in 1967, something changed. Corvin requested a transfer to a smaller, more remote facility. He wanted to work alone, he told his supervisors. He had a theory he needed to test, a theory that required isolation and absolute secrecy. After some bureaucratic resistance, his request was granted. In January of 1968, he was transferred to the Hanford Research Institute, a sprawling complex in southeastern Washington that had once produced plutonium for the Manhattan Project. He was assigned to Laboratory 7B, a small, windowless room in the oldest section of the facility. According to the Institute's records, Corvin's official project title was Temporal Displacement Effects in High-Energy Particle Collisions. The funding came from a Defense Department black budget program that was dissolved in 1978. But here's what makes his work unusual. While most physicists at Hanford collaborated extensively, published papers, and attended conferences, Corvin did none of these things. He worked alone. He published nothing. He attended no conferences. When colleagues tried to engage him in conversation about his research, he would smile politely and change the subject. He was like a monk, one former colleague recalled in a 1984 interview with the local paper. He'd arrive every morning at 7, leave every evening at 6, same schedule, every single day. And in all those years, I never once heard him talk about what he was actually doing in that lab. The newly released files from 2021 include Corvin's personal correspondence from this period. The letters, mostly written to his mother, who remained in New York until her death in 1979, reveal a man increasingly preoccupied with what he called the echo problem. He never explained what this meant in detail, but in a letter dated March the 3rd, 1976, he wrote something chilling. "I've begun to hear them, Mama. Not with my ears, that would be too simple. But I hear them nonetheless. Voices from times that haven't happened yet, or perhaps from times that happened long ago. They're trying to warn me about something. Or perhaps they're warning themselves. I can't tell the difference anymore." His mother apparently wrote back, concerned. Corvin's response, dated 2 weeks later, attempted to reassure her, "Please don't worry. I'm not going mad. If anything, I've never been more certain of my sanity. What I'm discovering is simply inconvenient for the world as we understand it. That's all." By 1980, subtle changes in Emil Corvin's behavior began to worry those few who knew him. He started arriving at the lab earlier, sometimes as early as 4 in the morning. Security logs from the facility show he would often work 16-hour days, leaving only when the night security guard physically reminded him the building was being locked. His apartment, a modest one-bedroom in the nearby town of Richland, became cluttered with newspapers. Not current newspapers, old ones. A landlord who entered the apartment for a maintenance issue in June of 1981 later told investigators that he'd found stacks of newspapers dating back to the 1940s, many with articles circled in red ink. When asked what the articles were about, the landlord couldn't remember details, but he did recall one thing. They were all about accidents, planes crashes, building collapses, that sort of thing. A strange thing to collect, if you ask me. The newly released files include photographs of these newspaper clippings, apparently cataloged by the FBI during their 1983 investigation. The articles span decades, but they share certain characteristics. Each describes an unexpected disaster. Each includes witness testimony describing unusual phenomena immediately before the event, strange sounds, temporal distortions, reports of seeing shadows that shouldn't have been there. In the margins of many articles, in Corvin's neat handwriting, appeared dates and times, often years or even decades after the original event. Next to an article about a 1947 factory explosion in Pennsylvania, he'd written, "Heard, March 12th, 1981, 3:47 a.m." Next to a 1953 mining disaster in Kentucky. "Heard, July 8th, 1980, 2:13 a.m." Whatever Corvin was hearing, he seemed to believe he was receiving these sounds years after the events themselves, or perhaps, more disturbingly, before they happened. His personal journal, also among the released files, becomes increasingly cryptic during this period. An entry from November 1980 reads, "The experiment has produced unexpected results. The barrier is not as solid as we believed. Information bleeds through. Not clearly, not completely, but enough to understand the terrible truth. Time does not protect us. We are visible to them, just as they are becoming visible to us. And once the connection is made, it cannot be severed. The echo continues, regardless of whether we listen." Who they were, Corvin never explicitly stated. But another entry, dated February 1981, provides a clue. "I understand now why Father was taken. He must have discovered something similar. Perhaps not in the same way. His tools were different, his mathematics more primitive. But he saw the pattern, and they couldn't allow him to share it. I thought I was being more careful. I thought working alone, publishing nothing, would keep me safe. But safety, I'm learning, is an illusion. They know when you know. Distance and discretion mean nothing when the barrier has been breached. It's worth noting that Corvin's father, taken during the Nazi occupation in 1944, was indeed a mathematician. Recently declassified records from Czech archives suggest he'd been working on cryptographic problems for the Czech resistance, specifically attempting to decode patterns in seemingly random radio interference. The nature of what he may have discovered remains unknown. In the spring of 1982, Corvin made an unusual request to the facility administrators. He wanted Laboratory 7B to be soundproofed, not just insulated for noise reduction, but completely isolated from external audio. He submitted a detailed proposal describing how the walls should be lined with specialized acoustic dampening materials, how the ventilation system should be redesigned to eliminate sound transmission, how even the door should be fitted with multiple seals. The request was denied on budgetary grounds. According to a memo found in the administrative files, the facility director wrote, "Dr. Corvin's request seems excessive for his stated research purposes. Recommend denial and suggest he provide more specific justification for such extensive modifications." Corvin never provided that justification. Instead, according to the security guard who worked the night shift, he began bringing in materials himself: foam panels, rubber ceiling strips, heavy blankets. He would stay in the lab until late at night, and colleagues who passed by the door reported hearing hammering and what sounded like furniture being moved. No one asked him what he was doing. At government research facilities during the Cold War, privacy around one's work was expected, even encouraged. If Dr. Corvin wanted to soundproof his own laboratory with his own money and his own labor, that was his prerogative. But in September of 1982, something changed. A janitor reported finding Corvin sitting in the hallway outside Laboratory 7B at 2 a.m, his back against the wall, eyes closed, hands pressed over his ears. When the janitor asked if he was all right, Corvin opened his eyes and said very quietly, "They're screaming tonight, all of them at once." Then he stood up, apologized for startling the janitor, and went back into his lab, locking the door behind him. The final year of Emil Corvin's documented life, November 1982 to November 1983, is marked by increasingly disturbing entries in his personal journal and a series of technical documents that suggest his research had reached some kind of critical threshold. Among the 2021 released files is a series of handwritten notes labeled Experiment Log, Final Series. The entries are dense with mathematical equations and physics terminology, much of it still being analyzed by specialists. But interspersed with the technical notations are observations that read more like horror than science. December 18th, 1982. Successfully established sustained resonance for 47 seconds. The sound is clearer now, not voices exactly, but the impression of voices, like hearing someone speak underwater or through a wall. They're aware of the connection. They're responding to my presence. One of them, I've started thinking of it as Subject A, seems to be trying to communicate something specific. A warning? A threat? I can't tell. But the urgency is unmistakable. January 3rd, 1983. Subject A is persistent. During last night's session, the resonance lasted nearly 3 minutes. I could almost make out words. It's speaking English, I think, though the accent is strange. Not foreign, but temporally displaced. Like listening to recordings from the 1940s, but wrong somehow. The pitch is distorted, as if the voice is struggling to exist in our acoustic space. February 20th, 1983. I've made a terrible mistake. I've been assuming the connection was one way, that I was observing them. But Subject A knows my name. it called me Emil 3 times during this morning's session, each time with increasing clarity. How? The only explanation is that the barrier works both ways. If I can hear them, they can hear me. And if they can hear me, what else can they perceive? The technical notes accompanying these entries describe what Corvin called temporal acoustic resonance, a theoretical phenomenon where sound waves could become trapped in quantum field fluctuations and potentially become accessible outside their normal temporal sequence. While this sounds like science fiction, several physicists who have reviewed Corvin's equations admit that his mathematics, while highly speculative, isn't obviously wrong. Dr. James Patterson, a theoretical physicist at the University of Melbourne who examined the released files, told reporters in February 2021, "What Corvin was proposing isn't technically impossible. It's just unlikely. Very unlikely." He was essentially suggesting that under extremely specific conditions, information could leak between different temporal states. Most of us would dismiss this as theoretical fantasy, but his math is rigorous. That's what makes these documents so unsettling. By the spring of 1983, Corvin had apparently stopped trying to establish contact and was instead attempting to sever the connection entirely. A series of entries from April and May describe increasingly desperate attempts to close the channel. April 30th, 1983. Disconnection attempt failed. The resonance reestablishes itself within hours, sometimes minutes. It's as if the connection has become self-sustaining. I've tried shutting down the equipment entirely. No effect. The phenomenon continues regardless of whether my instruments are active. This suggests the equipment was never the source, merely a tool for observation. The actual connection exists somewhere else. In me? In the space itself? I don't know. May 15th, 1983. They're not trying to warn me anymore. They're trying to come through. Subject A has been joined by others. I count at least 3 distinct voices now, possibly more. They speak over each other, urgent, pleading. They want something from me. Access, release. I can't understand what they're saying, but the emotional content is clear. Desperation. June 8th, 1983. I've realized who they are, or rather, when they are. I played back last night's recordings and finally isolated enough phonemes to reconstruct some of the speech. Subject A said, "The lab, November, you have to stop it." The voice wasn't from the past. It was from the future. My future. Subject A is me. I'm listening to myself screaming back through time, trying to warn my present self about something that hasn't happened yet. This entry is followed by a gap. No recordings for nearly 6 weeks. When the journal resumes in late July, Corvin's handwriting has deteriorated, and his entries become fragmented. July 28th, 1983. I won't let it happen. Whatever timeline leads to that version of me, that screaming, desperate version, I'll make sure we never reach it. There has to be a way to collapse the probability, to make that future impossible. August 14th, 1983. Began preparations. If I'm right, removing the fulcrum point should destabilize the entire sequence. The future cannot bleed back into the past if there is no past to receive it. Grandfather paradox, applied locally. It's the only way. September 22nd, 1983. They're angry now. I've stopped listening to them and they know it. The scratching started last night. Not on the recordings, but on the walls. Physical sound, audible without instruments. How is that possible? The barrier shouldn't allow. The entry ends mid-sentence. The next page has been torn out. The final entry in the journal is dated October the 30th, 1983, 2 weeks before Corvin's disappearance. I know what I have to do. I know what it will cost. But if I'm right, if the mathematics holds, then my absence is the key. Not death, absence. Complete ontological severance. No body, no burial, no confirmed end. A quantum state of existence. neither alive nor dead, but simply absent from the sequence entirely. Only then can the future collapse into probability again. Only then will the screaming stop. I'm sorry, Mama. I wish I could explain this to you, but by the time anyone reads these words, it will already be done. And if I'm right, no one will even remember there was anything to explain. The weeks leading up to November 14th, 1983, were marked by small, strange incidents at the Hanford Research Institute, incidents that only became significant in retrospect. On November 1st, a security camera monitoring the hallway outside Laboratory 7B malfunctioned. The footage from that night shows 12 minutes of static, followed by a brief, clear image of the hallway, empty, and then more static. When the camera was inspected the following morning, technicians found nothing wrong with it. Just a glitch, the maintenance report concluded. On November 3rd, a secretary working late in an adjacent building reported hearing what she described as music, but wrong somehow, coming from the direction of Laboratory 7B. When pressed for details, she said it sounded like a radio playing between stations, fragments of melody mixed with static, and what might have been voices. Security checked the lab that night. Dr. Corvin was inside, working. When asked about the music, he seemed genuinely puzzled and said he'd been working in silence all evening. On November 7th, the night janitor, the same one who'd found Corvin sitting in the hallway a year earlier, reported that the door to Laboratory 7B was warm to the touch. Not hot, but noticeably warm, like a wall that's been absorbing sunlight. There was no heating equipment in the lab that could account for this. The janitor mentioned it to the day shift supervisor, who shrugged it off. These old buildings were full of quirks. On November 11th, 3 days before the disappearance, a researcher in a nearby lab reported a brief power fluctuation that caused his equipment to reset. At exactly the same moment, according to facility logs, the electronic lock on Laboratory 7B cycled through 3 lock-unlock sequences in rapid succession, something it shouldn't have been able to do without manual input. Corvin was not in the lab at the time. He was in the parking lot, sitting in his car, staring at the building. A colleague who saw him there later told investigators, "I tapped on his window, asked if everything was okay. He rolled down the window and looked at me, and I swear, I've never seen anyone look so tired. Not physically tired, something else. Exhausted in a way that went deeper than lack of sleep." He said, "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's mistakes?" I didn't know what to say to that. Then he smiled, this sad, resigned smile, and said, "Don't worry, after tonight, everything will be fine." I thought he meant he was going on vacation or something. I said, "Have a good trip." And he laughed. Actually laughed. Then he drove away. The next day, November 12th, Corvin arrived at the facility at his usual time, but did something unusual. He went to the administrative office and requested copies of all his personnel files. When asked why, he said he was organizing some things at home. The request was granted, and he left with a manila folder containing copies of his employment history, security clearances, and published research papers, though, of course, he'd published nothing during his time at Hanford. That same afternoon, he visited the Richland Public Library. The librarian on duty remembered him because he asked for a specific microfilm roll, local obituaries from November 1983. When the librarian pointed out that it was currently November 1983 and those records wouldn't exist yet, Corvin stared at her for a long moment, then apologized for his confusion and asked instead for obituaries from November 1943. He spent 2 hours reviewing them, taking no notes, before thanking the librarian and leaving. November 13th, the day before his disappearance, was a Sunday. Normally, Corvin didn't come to the lab on Sundays, but the security logs show he entered Laboratory 7B at 6:42 a.m. and remained inside for 11 hours. During that time, the building's electrical systems experienced 3 separate brownouts, each lasting approximately 30 seconds. Engineers investigating the issue found no explanation. The power grid was functioning normally. At 5:47 p.m., Corvin emerged from the lab carrying a cardboard box. The security guard at the desk noticed him and waved. Corvin waved back, smiled, and said something the guard later couldn't quite remember. Something that might have been, "Thank you," or might have been, "I'm sorry." He placed the box in his car, locked the vehicle, and returned to Laboratory 7B. He was never seen again. The following morning, November 14th, when the janitor opened the lab and found it empty, he immediately noticed the smell. Not decay or chemicals, nothing that made immediate sense. Several witnesses described it as metallic, but also organic, like ozone, mixed with something burnt. The smell faded within an hour and was never adequately explained. The FBI investigation cataloged everything found in the lab. Beyond the missing notebooks and the cleaned chalkboards, there were strange details. All of Corvin's equipment was unplugged but undamaged. His desk chair was positioned in the exact center of the room, facing the door. The acoustic foam panels he'd installed over the previous year had been systematically removed and stacked neatly in the corner. And then there was the tape recorder, a reel-to-reel device sitting on the floor, conspicuously centered, as if deliberately placed for someone to find. The tape was missing, but a handwritten note was taped to the top. "Don't look for me. I'm not lost." The 3 words scratched into the desk. They were right, were never adequately explained. Right about what? Who were they? But here's the detail that still haunts investigators. When the FBI dusted the lab for fingerprints, they found Corvin's prints everywhere, as expected. But on the desk, underneath where the words were carved, they found something else. A partial palm print that didn't match Corvin's hands. The print was fresh, made within hours of the disappearance. It matched no one in the facility's database. In fact, when run through the National Fingerprint Database, it matched no one at all. As if whoever, or whatever, had been in that room with Corvin had never existed in any official capacity. The cardboard box that Emil Corvin placed in his car on the evening of November 13th was never found. His vehicle remained in the Hanford parking lot for 6 weeks before being towed to a police impound facility. When investigators finally searched it, they found nothing unusual. No box, no documents, no evidence of where Corvin might have gone. But the 2021 file release included something unexpected. A receipt. Found folded inside one of Corvin's personal journals was a deposit receipt from a self-storage facility in Pasco, Washington, dated November 13th, 1983, the day before his disappearance. Unit number 247, rental paid for 1 year in advance, cash. The receipt had been overlooked during the original investigation, tucked between pages of dense mathematical notation that the FBI had photographed but not thoroughly examined. When a research journalist followed up on this detail in January 2021, they discovered something remarkable. The storage facility still existed, though under different ownership. And more remarkably, Unit 247 had never been re-rented. The journalist's investigation revealed a bureaucratic oversight that seems almost impossible. The facility had changed hands 3 times since 1983. Each time, the records for Unit 247 were transferred, but never properly processed. The unit had simply fallen through the cracks, remaining locked, undisturbed, and forgotten for 42 years. When the journalist, accompanied by local police and the current facility manager, finally opened Unit 247 in February 2021, they found the cardboard box. Inside were items that tell a story more unsettling than any official investigation could have uncovered. First, there were 17 notebooks, the ones that had gone missing from Laboratory 7B. But these weren't research notebooks. They were personal journals dating back to 1968, documenting Corvin's entire time at Hanford. The entries were detailed, methodical, and increasingly disturbing. They described his growing awareness that his experiments were producing results that shouldn't be possible, his realization that he was receiving information from outside normal time, and his slow, horrifying understanding that whatever he discovered was something others had discovered before and had paid dearly for. Second, there were the newspapers. Not the clippings found in his apartment, but complete newspapers, carefully preserved in plastic sleeves. Dozens of them from dates spanning 1947 to 1983. But here's what made them extraordinary. Several of the newspapers were from dates after November 13th, 1983. One was from December 4th, 1983, 3 weeks after Corvin's disappearance. Another was from March 18th, 1984. A third was from September 22nd, 1995. These weren't forgeries. Paper analysis conducted by forensic experts confirmed that the physical newspapers were printed on paper stock consistent with their purported dates. The ink composition matched known formulations from those periods. If they were fabrications, they were elaborate ones, created with methods that would have been extraordinarily difficult in 1983. And the articles they contained were disturbingly specific. The December 1983 paper included a brief mention of a mysterious disappearance of a scientist from a Washington State research facility. The March 1984 paper mentioned the facility closing that section of the building due to structural concerns. The 1995 paper contained an obituary for a woman named Helen Corvin, Emil's mother, who died in 1979, according to all official records. But this obituary listed her death date as April 3rd, 1995, and mentioned she was survived by her son, Emil, whose whereabouts remain unknown. How could Corvin have possessed newspapers from dates that hadn't yet occurred when he disappeared? The implications are staggering and deeply unsettling. Third, there were the recordings. 8 reel-to-reel tapes, carefully labeled with dates and times. When played back, they contained what appeared to be audio recordings of Corvin's experiments, sessions where he'd attempted to establish what he called temporal acoustic resonance. The recordings were difficult to listen to, not because of poor quality, but because of their content. In the earliest recordings, from 1980, there's nothing but static and occasional electronic tones, the sound of equipment cycling through various frequencies. But in later recordings, there are voices, multiple voices, speaking over each other, their words often unintelligible, but their emotional tone clear. Urgency, fear, warning. In one recording from July 1983, a voice, distinct and relatively clear, says what sounds like, "Emil, you have to destroy it. The connection can't exist. Do you understand? It can't..." The voice cuts off into static. In another, from October 1983, multiple voices speak simultaneously, creating a chaotic chorus. But one phrase emerges clearly, repeated several times. November 14th. Don't be there. Don't. The final recording, dated November 12th, 1983, 2 days before the disappearance, is only 3 minutes long. It contains no static, no equipment noise, just a single voice, calm and resigned. It's unmistakably Corvin's own voice, but the acoustic properties are wrong somehow, as if the recording was made in a space that shouldn't exist. The voice says, "If you're hearing this, then I was wrong about how the collapse would occur. I thought removing myself would be enough, but the connection persists. The mathematics was incomplete. I missed something fundamental. To anyone who finds this, don't try to reproduce my work. Don't attempt to establish resonance." The barrier exists for a reason. Some forms of knowledge carry an ontological weight that reality cannot support. Once you know, once you truly understand how thin the walls are, you become a point of instability. You become dangerous to the structure itself. They weren't trying to silence me because of what I knew. They were trying to protect me from what knowing would do to me. And I didn't listen. I'm so sorry. I didn't listen. There's a pause then. The screaming never stops, by the way. Just so you know. Even after you leave, even after you think you've escaped, you carry it with you. You become the echo you were trying to escape. The future is fixed, but not in the way you think. We're all trapped in our own loops, trying desperately to warn our past selves, never realizing that the warning itself is what creates the The recording ends abruptly. Fourth, and finally, there was a letter. A single handwritten page addressed to whoever opens this box. The letter explained in careful detail why Corvin had decided to disappear. He described how his research had revealed what he called temporal bleed, a phenomenon where information could leak between different states of time under specific quantum conditions. He explained that he'd inadvertently created a stable connection to multiple future timelines, all of which showed versions of himself trying desperately to communicate back through time. And he explained that, according to his calculations, the only way to collapse those timelines and prevent what he saw as an inevitable cascade failure was to create a paradox, to remove himself from the timeline completely, not through death, but through absolute absence. No body means no confirmation, he wrote. No confirmation means the quantum state remains unresolved, and an unresolved state cannot serve as an anchor point for temporal resonance. If I am neither alive nor dead, but simply absent, then the future versions of me cannot exist to send warnings back, which means I never received warnings, which means I never conducted the experiments that led to the warnings. The loop collapses. Reality corrects itself, or at least that's the theory. He ended the letter with a single, chilling sentence. If you're reading this, then I failed, and you should run. The release of the storage unit contents in 2021 created immediate controversy. Skeptics argued that the future newspapers were elaborate hoaxes, that the recordings were manipulated, that Corvin had suffered a psychological breakdown, and his final writings were the products of delusion. But there were problems with these explanations. The newspapers, while seemingly impossible, have been authenticated by multiple forensic analysts. The paper, the ink, the printing methods, all consistent with their claimed dates. If they're forgeries that would have required resources and expertise far beyond what a single physicist working alone could have managed. The recordings have been analyzed by audio forensic experts. While the voices are strange, there are no signs of digital manipulation, largely because the recordings were made on analog tape in an era before sophisticated audio editing software existed. The acoustic anomalies, rather than suggesting forgery, suggest the recordings captured something that shouldn't have been possible to record. And then there are the predictions. Some of the future newspapers contain information about events that did, in fact, occur. The March 1984 paper mentioned the closure of Laboratory 7B, which happened in March 1984. The 1995 obituary for Helen Corvin listed her as having lived in a specific assisted living facility in Queens, New York, a facility that wasn't built until 1986. How could Corvin have known any of this in 1983? Dr. James Patterson, the Melbourne physicist who examined Corvin's equations, offered a careful assessment in a March 2021 interview. I'm not saying I believe Dr. Corvin achieved what he claimed, but I am saying that his mathematics is sophisticated enough that we can't simply dismiss it. If, and this is a significant if quantum mechanics allows for the kind of temporal information transfer he described, then his experimental approach would be theoretically sound. That doesn't mean it worked. It just means we can't prove it didn't. In April 2021, a team of physicists attempted to replicate aspects of Corvin's experiment at a facility in Brisbane, using his notes as a guide. The experiment was terminated after 3 days. The official statement cited unexpected equipment malfunctions and concerns about researcher safety. Unofficially, sources involved with the project reported experiencing auditory phenomena, sounds that shouldn't have been present, voices that seemed to come from nowhere. It was probably psychological, one researcher admitted. We'd read Corvin's journals. We knew what he claimed to hear, so we primed ourselves to hear things too. That's the rational explanation. But I've worked in labs for 20 years, and I've never felt the kind of dread I felt in that room, like we were being watched or warned. The experiment has not been repeated. As for Emil Corvin himself, he remains officially missing. His body was never found. No evidence of foul play was ever discovered. The FBI closed its investigation in 1984, concluding that Corvin had likely suffered a mental breakdown and either died by accident or chose to disappear voluntarily. But there are small, strange footnotes to the story that continue to accumulate. In 1997, a security guard at a research facility in Maryland reported seeing a man matching Corvin's description standing outside the building at 3 a.m. When the guard approached, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. The guard thought nothing of it until seeing a photograph of Corvin years later and realizing the resemblance. In 2003, a physics professor at Stanford received an anonymous letter containing a solution to a complex problem in temporal mechanics, a problem that had stumped researchers for decades. The handwriting in the letter was later compared to Corvin's journals. Several forensic analysts stated that the handwriting was consistent with Corvin's style, though they couldn't definitively confirm a match. In 2018, a hiker in the Cascade Mountains reported finding a small cairn of stones in a remote area. Underneath the cairn was a waterproof container holding a single page of mathematical equations and a handwritten note that read, "Still trying, still failing. The loop tightens." The note was dated November 14th, 2018, exactly 35 years after Corvin's disappearance. DNA testing on the note was inconclusive due to environmental degradation, but the handwriting, again, was consistent with Corvin's. And in January 2021, when the storage unit was opened and the contents cataloged, one of the investigators reported something strange. While examining the reel-to-reel tapes, they briefly left the room, leaving the tapes on a table. When they returned 5 minutes later, there was an additional tape that hadn't been there before, same type, same storage condition, but not mentioned in the original inventory. When played, it contained 3 minutes of silence, followed by a single sentence in Corvin's voice. The box was supposed to stay closed. That tape has since disappeared. Multiple investigators insist they saw it, handled it, heard it, but it's no longer in evidence. It's as if it never existed. We're left with an unsettling possibility that Emil Corvin wasn't delusional, wasn't fabricating evidence, and didn't simply vanish into the wilderness to escape his demons. That he was, instead, telling the truth about what he'd discovered, and that his disappearance was exactly what he claimed it would be, an attempt to collapse a timeline that had become unbearably, impossibly connected to its own future. The question isn't whether we believe him. The question is whether we're willing to accept what his story implies. That time may not be the linear, protective barrier we assume it to be. That under certain conditions, the walls between past, present, and future become permeable. That information, perhaps even consciousness itself, can bleed through. And most unsettling of all, that once you create a connection to your own future, once you hear yourself screaming back through time, you may have already set in motion the very events you're trying to prevent. Laboratory 7B remains sealed. In 2024, during a routine inspection, structural engineers reported unusual electromagnetic readings in the room, readings that shouldn't exist in an empty, unpowered space. When asked to investigate further, the engineering team declined. Their report simply states, "Recommend permanent closure of this section. No further explanation necessary." The room remains locked. The door is marked with a simple warning. Restricted area, do not enter. There's no mention of Dr. Emil Corvin, no memorial plaque, no acknowledgement that anything unusual ever occurred there. But sometimes, according to the night security staff, you can hear something if you stand outside that door in the early hours of the morning. Not voices exactly, not screaming, just a sound. Like someone knocking from very far away, or from somewhere that isn't quite here. A sound that might be equipment malfunction or wind in the ventilation system, or it might be the echo of a man who tried to erase himself from time and discovered, too late, that erasure and escape are not the same thing, that once you become part of the pattern, you can't simply step outside it, You can only move through it, eternally warning, eternally trying, eternally failing. They were right, Corvin carved into his desk. Right about what? We may never know, but perhaps that's for the best. Some doors once opened can never truly be closed. Some knowledge carries a weight that bends reality around it. And some mysteries are mysteries not because we lack answers, but because the answers themselves are dangerous to know. Dr. Emil Corvin disappeared from Laboratory 7B on November 14th, 1983. Officially, he's still missing. Officially, his research led nowhere. His theories were unfounded. His fears were symptoms of mental illness. But late at night, in research facilities around the world, physicists working on the bleeding edge of the temporal mechanics sometimes report hearing things they can't explain. Voices in the static, warnings from nowhere, the sensation of being watched by their own future selves. Most of them dismiss it as stress, as imagination, as the mind playing tricks in the lonely hours of deep research. They continue their work. They push forward into territories where few have ventured. And perhaps, somewhere beyond the thin walls of time, Emil Corvin is still trying to warn them, still knocking, still screaming back through decades that refuse to protect him, still trapped in the loop he tried so desperately to break. If you found this story compelling, you're not alone. The files released in 2021 have sparked renewed interest in fringe physics research and the question of what our reality truly is. But they've also served as a warning. Some frontiers exist, not to be crossed, but to be respected. Hit that like button if this story gave you chills, and subscribe for more historical mysteries that blur the line between science and the unknown. Because the universe, it seems, has secrets it's not ready to share, and perhaps never will be. Thanks for watching. And remember, if you ever find yourself hearing warnings from a future you haven't lived yet, maybe, just maybe, you should listen.